I only wanted to check if the security cameras were finally working again. After weeks of glitches, I hired a company to fix the system in the house I own in Provo, Utah. The house I let my daughter, Claire, and her husband, Jonathan, live in without paying rent. It was supposed to be a simple test, nothing more than watching a live feed flicker back to life. But one clip made my hands shake so badly I thought I might drop the keyboard. My name is Steve Marlowe. I'm 60 years old, a retired police officer, and I've seen my share of crime scenes and interrogations. I thought nothing could rattle me anymore. But that day, sitting in my own living room with two technicians tightening cables behind me, I realized I was wrong. The screen jumped from static to a recording saved a few nights earlier. At first, all I saw was my kitchen, the one I remodeled with my own hands before Claire moved in. She was standing by the counter, her back bent as she wiped her eyes with a dish towel. She looked so small, so unlike the daughter who once ran through these halls laughing, barefoot and fearless. And then, Jonathan's voice cut through the speakers. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even angry. It was quiet, almost calm, and somehow that made it worse. If you tell your father how I treat you, it'll be the last time you see him. The towel slipped from Claire's hands. She covered her mouth as if to keep the sob from escaping. And in that moment, my entire world tilted. The technicians didn't notice. To them, it was just another camera rebooting, another feed restored. But for me, it was a punch to the chest. I minimized the video, nodded as if everything looked fine, and waited until they left. My pulse hammered as I pulled up the archive again, my fingers moving with the old precision I hadn't used since my days on the force. The habits came back to me automatically. Preserve the evidence, make a copy, never trust the system to hold what matters. By the time the front door clicked shut behind the repairman, I had already copied not one, but two recordings onto a flash drive I kept hidden in my pocket. 2 different days, 2 different scenes, both of them showing Jonathan's true face. Claire cooking dinner while he stood behind her, his words like a noose tightening around her life. Claire seated at the kitchen table, shoulders slumped, while he leaned close and murmured something that made her flinch. I pressed pause and stared at her face, frozen on the screen. My daughter, my only child, the same girl I'd sworn to protect from the moment I first held her in my arms. And yet here she was, crying under the roof of my own house, afraid of the man she had married. Chill crept up my spine, the kind I hadn't felt since the night I walked into a crime scene that still haunts me. But this was different. This wasn't a stranger's tragedy. It was mine. That night, as the sun dipped behind the Wasatch Mountains, I sat in the dark, with only the glow of the paused video illuminating the room. The evidence was clear, undeniable. But the question that burned in my chest was this: how long had it been going on? And more terrifying, what else had I missed?
I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Claire's face frozen on the screen, her shoulders trembling as Jonathan whispered his poison. I kept replaying the words in my head, dissecting them like evidence in an interrogation room. If you tell your father how I treat you. How long had he been treating her this way? And how had I missed it? I thought back over the past few years. The memories that once felt like harmless excuses now landed like heavy stones. Birthdays where Claire canceled at the last minute, saying Jonathan had to work late and she didn't want to leave the house empty. Phone calls that went unanswered for days, followed by her voice on the line, soft and apologetic. "Sorry, Dad, I've just been tired." The time she cut visits short, her eyes darting toward the door as if she was afraid of being late getting home. At the time, I told myself she was busy, building her life, maybe struggling with the weight of adulthood like everyone does. But now, in the silence of my living room, it was obvious. Those weren't random moments. They were pieces of a pattern. A net Jonathan had cast around her, drawing her tighter into his control. I remembered the Christmas dinner when she sat at my table, barely touching her food. Jonathan kept his arm draped casually around her chair, but his eyes never left her. Every time I tried to draw her into a story, she smiled faintly and then glanced at him as if she was waiting for permission to laugh. I should have seen it then. I was a cop for 30 years. I knew what fear looked like, but I ignored it because I wanted to believe she was happy. And there were the visits to the house itself. I noticed little things at the time, but brushed them aside. The way her cell phone always seemed to be in Jonathan's pocket instead of hers. The landline disconnected even though I had offered to pay for it. The mailbox locked with only one key that he carried. Jonathan always had an explanation, smooth and reasonable. And I, blinded by the desire not to meddle, accepted them. Now I saw the truth. He hadn't just isolated her, he had cut every thread that tied her to me, strand by strand, until she stood alone in a cage he had built. The thought made my stomach twist. All those missed dinners, unanswered calls, hurried excuses, it wasn't Claire pulling away from me, it was Jonathan pulling her away. And I had let it happen right under my nose. I pushed my chair back and stood, pacing the room, like I had in the squad years ago when the pressure of a case refused to let me sit still. My hands clenched at my sides. I felt the same fire I used to feel when I knew a suspect was lying to me, the same restless energy that drove me to dig deeper, to uncover the truth, no matter how carefully it was hidden. For the first time since retirement, I felt that fire returning. But this time, it wasn't about closing a case. It was about saving my daughter. I stopped at the window, staring out at the quiet street of Provo, the lights glowing softly in neighboring houses. Somewhere out there, people were tucking their children into bed, safe in the illusion that their homes protected them. I had believed that illusion myself until I saw the recording. And then, like a whisper out of the past, I heard another voice in my mind. Not Jonathan's, but an older one, gentler, threaded with concern. A neighbor's words, spoken more than once, words I had shrugged off at the time. "Steve, your daughter looks so tired these days. Is everything all right at home?" At the time, I thought it was just a nosy question from an old woman. But now, with Claire's sobs still echoing in my head, those words cut deeper, because the neighbor had seen it too. The words of my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, echoed louder than Jonathan's threat. She was in her late 70s, sharp as a tack, with the kind of watchful eyes only age and solitude can sharpen. She had lived across the street for as long as I could remember, sitting on her porch most evenings with a blanket over her knees and a pair of binoculars within reach. She never missed a thing. I used to smile at her small comments, chalking them up to the natural curiosity of someone with too much time on her hands. But now, each memory hit me like evidence I had refused to log. There was the afternoon when she leaned over the fence, her voice quiet but steady. "Steve, your daughter looked upset yesterday. She was carrying groceries, and Jonathan took the bags from her a little too roughly. Maybe I saw it wrong, but something didn't sit right." At the time, I laughed it off. "Jonathan's probably just tired from work," I told her, brushing it aside. But the image came back to me now, sharper, and I realized she hadn't been mistaken. Then another time, she mentioned how she rarely saw Claire driving her own car. "Strange, isn't it?" she said. "A young woman with a license always walking or waiting for Jonathan to pick her up." I remember shrugging, saying maybe Claire preferred it that way. But that wasn't true. Claire had loved driving since the day she got her license. She used to beg me to let her take my old cruiser for a spin. And one evening, not long after Christmas, Mrs. Henderson lowered her voice as if sharing a secret. "I don't mean to pry, Steve, but Jonathan raises his voice often. I hear it through the open windows. Your daughter's tone is always soft, apologetic. It worries me." That should have been the moment I paid attention. That should have been the moment I asked questions, demanded answers. But I told myself not to meddle, not to imagine monsters where there might be none. After all, Claire always defended him, always smiled when I asked how things were going. But Mrs. Henderson had seen what I refused to. Now, sitting at my desk with the flash drive hidden in the drawer, I replayed her words in my head. They weren't idle gossip. They were warnings, clear, consistent, and ignored. And I realized with a sinking weight that Jonathan hadn't just fooled me. He had fooled everyone, wrapping himself in the image of the devoted husband, while stripping Claire of her freedom piece by piece. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at Mrs. Henderson's house across the street. Her porch light was on, as always. I wondered if she was sitting there now, still watching, still worrying. Maybe she suspected more than she dared to say. Maybe she was the only one besides me who had seen the cracks in Jonathan's mask. For the first time in years, I felt ashamed, not as a father, but as a man who once prided himself on reading people, on noticing the smallest tells. Mrs. Henderson had handed me the truth in fragments, and I had filed them away as background noise. Now the fragments were forming a picture I could no longer deny. And in that picture, Jonathan Pierce wasn't just a controlling husband. He was something far darker, far more deliberate. The next morning, I woke with the uneasy feeling that something was still unfinished. The recordings I'd copied burned in my mind like a brand. I hadn't watched them fully, only enough to know Jonathan's words with threats and Claire's tears were real. But now, with the house silent and no one around, I sat back down at the desk, plugged in the flash drive, and pressed play. The first clip was the same one I had stumbled across with the technicians present, Claire in the kitchen, Jonathan's voice cutting her down with a promise that chilled my blood. I forced myself to watch it again, every detail, every flinch, every pause. I told myself I needed to see it not as a father, but as I once would have as a detective, searching for clues, context, meaning. But it was the second recording that made my stomach twist. It started innocently enough, Jonathan pacing the living room, his jacket still on, speaking too loudly for someone who believed he was alone. Claire sat on the couch, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed red. "You don't understand," Jonathan snapped, his voice rising before dropping again to that cold whisper I had come to dread. "Your father's not going to live forever, and when he's gone, everything, this house, his savings, the retirement funds, will pass to you. Which means, Claire, they'll pass to us, unless you ruin it by opening your mouth." Claire shook her head, whispering something I couldn't catch, but Jonathan cut her off. "Don't look at me like that. You think he lets you live here out of love? No, it's obligation. He feels guilty, that's all. But once it's ours, no more waiting, no more smiling politely at him while he meddles. One day, all of this will belong to us, and I won't let you screw it up." My chest tightened as I listened. The words weren't just cruel, they were calculated. Jonathan didn't see Claire as his wife. He saw her as a key to the life he thought he deserved, the fortune he thought was his by right. For years, I had convinced myself that her distance was normal, that Jonathan was simply protective, maybe too much so. But this was different. This wasn't just a man insecure in his marriage. This was greed, cold, consuming greed wrapped in the disguise of a husband. I leaned back in my chair, hands pressed against my face. Every sacrifice I had made, working nights, missing holidays, scrimping to pay off this very house, suddenly seemed like ammunition in his hands. He was using my love for Claire as leverage, twisting it into chains that bound her tighter to him. And the worst part? Claire knew it. I could see it in her eyes on the recording, the flicker of awareness, the fear that if she admitted the truth, Jonathan would lash out at me, maybe even hurt me. She wasn't just silent out of fear for herself. She was silent out of fear for me. The realization was a knife to the gut. I paused the video, the screen frozen on Jonathan's smirk. I had seen plenty of men like him in interrogation rooms, men who thought they were clever enough to outsmart everyone, men who hid their cruelty behind smooth talk and clean suits. Some of them fooled the system for years. But Jonathan wasn't just another case. He was in my house, with my daughter. I knew then that this wasn't about suspicion anymore. It was about proof. And I had it. The only question left was, what would I do with it?
Once you've worn the badge, even after retirement, you never really stop being a cop. The habits cling to you. The way you notice details, the way you read between the lines of what people say, the way silence makes you suspicious. After watching those recordings, I felt those instincts surge back like they'd been waiting beneath the surface for years. So I did what I used to do best. I started digging. I began with the basics, public records, online searches, things any curious neighbor could have done. Jonathan's resume painted him as a steady man, mid-level manager for a logistics company, stable income, decent credit. But the deeper I went, the more cracks appeared. His employment history was peppered with sudden moves, short stays, and unexplained gaps. I knew those patterns. Men who couldn't hold their ground, men who left before questions grew too loud. I reached out to a friend from my old precinct, someone who still had access to databases I couldn't touch anymore. I kept my request vague, but he owed me enough to look into it. 2 days later, he called back. "Steve," he said, his voice tight, "you know your son-in-law's name shows up more than once." My gut clenched. "Nothing that stuck," my friend continued. "No convictions. But there are incident reports, 2, maybe 3, that mention him. Domestic disturbances. Always dismissed, always settled quietly." I thanked him, though the words caught in my throat. When I hung up, my hands trembled as I scribbled down the details he'd given me. 2 different states, 2 different women, both relationships ending abruptly, both women filing complaints that never went anywhere. I didn't need a conviction to know what that meant. I had seen the same pattern too many times before. Charm in public, cruelty behind closed doors, and victims too scared or too worn down to fight back. The thought that my daughter had married into that pattern nearly broke me. But I kept digging. Old addresses led me to names, and names led me to whispers. One woman, an ex-girlfriend from years ago, had left town completely. A neighbor described how she vanished overnight after trouble with her boyfriend. Another woman, an ex-wife, I learned, had remarried and refused to speak of the past. But her silence was telling. People who carry no scars have no reason to stay quiet. Each clue painted Jonathan with sharper edges. Each silence screamed louder than words. I sat in my study late into the night, piecing together the puzzle, my old notebooks spread across the desk. Claire's face kept flashing in my mind, her tears, her trembling hands. She wasn't just unlucky. She was the latest in a line of women Jonathan had chosen, broken, and discarded. And now I understood why he was clinging to her so tightly. Claire wasn't just another conquest. She was the one with something worth taking, the inheritance. The danger had escalated. Jonathan wasn't going to let go, not this time. As the weight of that realization pressed down on me, I heard a sound outside my window, the crunch of gravel under tires. I pulled the curtain back just enough to see Jonathan's car pulling into the driveway earlier than usual. My chest tightened. Had he seen me watching? Did he know I was digging into his past? I stepped back into the shadows, heart hammering, the flash drive still burning like a secret in my pocket. For the first time since this started, I wondered if Jonathan had already begun to suspect me.
I sat in the dark, the glow of the monitor casting long shadows across the room. The files I had gathered, Jonathan's past, the recordings, the notes from my old friend at the precinct, were spread out like evidence in an investigation. But this wasn't just a case. This was my daughter's life. In the force, decisions were calculated. You waited for backup, you assessed the risks, you never went in blind. But sitting there, staring at Claire's face frozen on the screen, I felt the father in me screaming to kick down the door, drag her out, and end it all that same night. And yet, another voice, the voice of the cop I used to be, whispered caution. Men like Jonathan didn't give up when cornered. They escalated. They lashed out. If I pushed too soon, Claire could pay the price. I poured myself a glass of water, my hands shaking more than I cared to admit. The truth was simple but unbearable. Doing nothing was dangerous. Acting too fast was dangerous. Either way, the stakes were Claire's life. I tried to imagine what she felt, trapped in that house, carrying the weight of silence. She wasn't just afraid for herself, she was afraid for me. That realization tore me apart. My daughter had been protecting me, when all along it should have been the other way around. I picked up the flash drive, holding it between my fingers like a weapon. It was proof, undeniable and damning, but proof only mattered if it was used. Should I take it to the police? Should I confront Jonathan face to face? Or should I wait, gather more, and make sure I had enough to bury him beyond denial? Every path felt like walking a tightrope with no net below. I stepped outside onto the porch, the night air in Provo cold against my skin. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson's porch light glowed softly. I wondered if she was awake, if she still worried about Claire the way she always had. Maybe she saw me pacing now, just as she had seen Claire's tired eyes and Jonathan's raised voice. I clenched my fists, torn between rage and restraint. In my career, I had faced men with guns, men with knives, men who thought they were untouchable. But I had never felt so helpless as I did now, staring at the quiet house that held my daughter captive in silence. And then, as if the night itself conspired to answer me, I remembered the second recording, the one I had barely skimmed, too sickened to finish. I went back inside, slipped the drive into the computer, and pressed play. Jonathan's voice filled the room once more, but this time it was different, colder, more deliberate. You think your father will protect you? He's old, weak. He won't stand in my way. If I have to get rid of obstacles to secure what's mine, I will. Don't doubt me. The words sank into me like ice water. Obstacles. That's what he called me. An obstacle. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. For the first time, I realized Jonathan wasn't just manipulating Claire. He was planning ahead, planning for me. The dilemma that had tortured me only minutes earlier suddenly sharpened into a terrifying clarity. Jonathan Pierce wasn't just a threat to my daughter. He was a threat to me.
The word obstacle wouldn't leave my mind. I'd heard plenty of threats in my years as a cop, but hearing Jonathan say it with that eerie calm made it different. It wasn't rage, it wasn't bluster, it was intent. I played the clip again, this time forcing myself to watch Jonathan's face closely. He wasn't pacing like before. He was composed,
his hands folded in front of him as if rehearsing a speech. Claire sat silent, her eyes fixed on the floor. He leaned toward her, his voice almost tender, like a man explaining simple math to a child. Your father's stubborn. He doesn't know when to stop meddling. But once everything is in our name, none of that will matter. If he gets in the way, he'll regret it. Do you understand me? Claire nodded quickly, almost desperately, as if agreeing was the only way to keep the peace. I recognized that nod. It was the nod of survival. I'd seen it in victims too many times, people agreeing to anything to stop the monster in front of them. My chest burned. I paused the recording, my reflection staring back at me from the darkened screen. For weeks, maybe months, Jonathan had been planting fear in my daughter's heart, and now he was planting fear in mine, not with fists or shouting, but with the slow, deliberate certainty of a man who believed he was untouchable. I couldn't let it continue, not another day. I opened my old lockbox, the one that had sat untouched since retirement. Inside were remnants of another life, a badge long retired, a service pistol I kept more for memory than for need, and notebooks filled with cases that once consumed me. I picked up the pistol, feeling the weight in my hand, then set it back down. I didn't want this to end in violence, but I also knew men like Jonathan didn't back down with words alone. For hours, I sat at the desk, reviewing every piece of evidence I had collected, the recordings, the notes on his past, the names of the women he had broken before Claire. Each detail painted the same picture. Jonathan Pierce wasn't a man who would stop. He was a man who would escalate until nothing stood between him and what he wanted. And what he wanted was Claire, her silence, her inheritance, and eventually, my absence. The thought made my hands tremble with anger. For years, I had told myself retirement meant peace, that I had earned the right to rest. But Jonathan had dragged me back into a fight I could never walk away from. This wasn't about law or duty or justice in the courtroom. This was about blood, about family, about a father who refused to stand by while his daughter was consumed. As dawn broke over Provo, the first light creeping over the Wasatch Mountains, I knew I had made my decision. I slipped the flash drive into my pocket, locked the door behind me, and walked down the steps of my porch. The street was silent, but my heart thundered in my chest. Every step toward Claire's house felt like walking into the kind of scene I'd once warned rookies never to rush. But I wasn't a rookie anymore, and I wasn't walking in as a cop. I was walking in as a father. I reached the door, lifted my hand, and knocked. Inside, I heard footsteps.
The door opened, and there he was, Jonathan Pierce, calm, collected, that polished mask of respectability still plastered across his face. He smiled faintly, though his eyes flickered with something colder when he saw me standing there.
"Steve," he said smoothly, "early visit, isn't it?" I stepped past him without asking, years of authority guiding my body before my mind caught up. The house smelled of coffee and silence. Claire was at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug, eyes widening when she saw me. "Dad," her voice trembled, a mixture of relief and fear. Jonathan shut the door, his tone sharpening. "What's this about?" I pulled the flash drive from my pocket and set it on the table between us. "It's about this," I said. For the first time, Jonathan's composure cracked. His eyes darted to Claire, then back to me. "I don't know what you think you have." "Don't," I cut him off, my voice steady. "I've heard every word. I've seen her tears. I know about the inheritance. I know about the women before her. And I know what you called me, an obstacle." The silence in the room was suffocating. Claire's hands shook around her mug. Jonathan's jaw tightened, the mask slipping inch by inch. "You don't understand," he finally muttered, his voice low, desperate. "She needs guidance. She needs someone to make decisions. She needs freedom. She needs peace. And she'll have both, starting now. Claire's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't silent ones. She pushed the mug aside, her voice breaking as she spoke for the first time in what felt like years. Dad's right. I can't keep living like this, Jonathan. I can't. Jonathan turned toward her, his tone rising, but I stepped between them before the words could leave his mouth. I had stood in that position before, shielding victims, standing firm between cruelty and the people it fed on. But this time, it wasn't just a case. This was my daughter. You're finished, I said, my voice low but unshakable. Every lie, every threat, it's all on here. And if you think I won't use it, try me. For a moment, Jonathan just stared at me, his breathing heavy, the mask shattered. Then he turned, grabbed his jacket from the chair, and stormed out without another word. The door slammed so hard the walls shook, but the silence that followed was different, lighter, free. Claire collapsed into my arms, sobbing openly now, years of silence spilling out in broken gasps. I held her tightly, the way I had when she was a child afraid of storms. Only this storm had lasted far longer. Across the street, through the window, I saw Mrs. Henderson's porch light still glowing. I wondered if she had heard the door slam, if she knew that at last her warnings had found their place. I stroked Claire's hair, whispering, "It's over. He won't hurt you again." But in my chest, I knew the truth. It wasn't entirely over. Men like Jonathan didn't vanish easily. There would be consequences, battles ahead, maybe courts and lawyers. But for the first time in years, Claire wasn't facing them alone. As the morning light spilled into the kitchen, I realized the inheritance Jonathan craved had never been about money. It was about love, trust, and the bond he could never buy or break. And that morning, in the quiet of my own house, I inherited my daughter back.